see a few familiar faces. This is my first BPI Summit, but I see a few familiar faces out there and people who may have known me in my past life. I just left the Coca-Cola company after 30 years 2 months ago. So I'm calling myself unaffiliated right now as I sort of transition into a new portfolio career of teaching and consulting. Unaffiliated is not altogether true because I do teach sustainability strategy at both Emory and Georgia Tech. I'm currently teaching this fall in the Master of Sustainable Energy and Environmental Management program in the School of Public Policy. I know there are a couple students and former students in the audience today. So again, thanks so much for having me here. In my time at Coca-Cola, I went back and forth between our global operations and our North America business unit. I was sort of back and forth between sort of technical and supply chain and public affairs and strategy. I'm so involved, with the sustainability agenda for years and years. One of my sort of favorite roles along the way, which was sort of mid-career, was I was embedded in our global procurement team. So engaging with suppliers around sustainability and what that meant, helped build out the Coca-Cola Sustainable Agriculture Program, and that's when I sort of first went deep around sustainability certifications and what all that can mean. Round about that same time, I watched a TED Talk. I think that was about 15 years ago when TED Talks were sort of all the rage, and I know they're still around, and there's a lot of great content with TED. But does anyone recognize this person here, Jason Clay from World Wildlife Fund? So Jason Clay at World Wildlife Fund, famous TED Talk from 2010 that I would suggest for all of you, really led the development within World Wildlife Fund and then the broader NGO community around the idea of sort of roundtables and collective action across industry to drive progress on a particular issue. So Jason and the WWF team basically mapped out the top 10 commodities around the world, agricultural commodities that have the most, environmental and social impact, and then the top 10 companies for each of those 10 commodities. And they basically said, with those 100 companies, so the top 10 companies for the top 10 commodities, they could engage half or 25% of the supply chain of each of those priority commodities if they could just get those 10 companies for each commodity to sort of sit down, think together about what sustainability really meant for that commodity, right? Build it out in terms of a standard or a certification, all adopt it, and then they would reach a tipping point for making that, move forward within broader industry. So here I was at the time, embedded in our global procurement team, trying to figure out what sustainable agriculture meant for the Coca-Cola company, what did sustainability mean as it related to the other things that we buy or bought at the time, right? And this was also around the time when corporations in general were first starting to think about, full supply chain thinking. If you think about it in the context of emissions and scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, it was back in that 2010, 2012, 2013 sort of time frame when big companies were first starting to look at, oh wait, our impacts aren't just based on the production facilities that we have and the operations that we have and the trucks that we have on the road, but 90+% of our impact is based on the things that we buy, right? And so that's when you started to see a real drive and a real push around certifications and standards. Now, from you all, and I know we've got sort of everybody represented in the room, right? From the upstream, of all of this to the downstream and the composters and everybody sort of in between. What do the downstream buyers really care about most when it comes to standards and certifications? And so I talk for a minute just about brands and retailers and then consumers. I think on the consumer side, pretty much everything that's, you would hear, Suzanne Shelton said it yesterday. Really good data on where consumers are today, where their heads are today. Frankly, I think there is, and I don't know if you remember, I asked her a quick question about what about the media and the politics and landscape in the world today? How is that going to impact consumer perspective around sustainability? And then, in what they ask of corporations and businesses. I don't know if we all have a real answer for that yet, but it is clear that consumers care more about this stuff than they ever have. Now, consumers, I would say, if I go back to undergrad years 30 plus years ago, I believe there were consumer studies then, and I think consumer studies then and ever since then, will talk about different types of consumers, how everybody wants to do the right thing, and how everybody says, yes, sustainability is important to the things that I buy and I purchase and what I do, and I want to do more, and I think companies should do more. When you ask people the question of, will they pay more for it, that's when the numbers go way down. And so I want us to be realistic about that, because that, I think, is very key to some of the brand and retailer perspective when it comes to standards and certifications, right? When they don't necessarily want to maybe pay more for a standard or a certification or a logo or a mark, because they don't necessarily see the ability or feel the ability of passing that down. Now, what are some of the other things that brands and retailers care about? Margaret really sort of said it. It's truth, it's facts, it's assurance. Is this really making a difference, right? As a brand or a retailer, I would want to know, I don't want it to be a check the box exercise, right? But I want to know if I'm going to buy a label on something, that has to have the deep meaning behind it, right? And so the piece around truth, and I know Sam's going to go deep on all of that, I think is very important. On the brand and retailer perspective, a little bit deeper, I want to also just sort of reference or make mention of, it's not just about those obvious, what I would call external value drivers, like, okay, are consumers going to buy more? Are they going to pay more? Are you going to sell more of your product because it's more sustainable? There's real internal value for brands and retailers in buying the right stuff, right? In short, if there's a standard or a certification that they can lean on, that means they don't have to define what is good themselves, right? That takes a ton of work off the sustainability team in the company, right? And the company in general, right? If you can lean on something that's already sort of third-party verified and defined. I talk about the cost piece. I think a key thing here is understanding what those costs are, understanding if there's a premium, what is that about, try to unpack that a little bit, unbundle that so the brands and the retailers understand why does a standard or a certification cost more. That leads us to a little bit around challenges and barriers. Suzanne talked about greenwashing and green hushing, and I mean, we hear those words every day, right, with what we do. Greenwashing, been around as an idea for 30 plus years, right, and, huge threat to big corporations, right, lawsuits more and more every day, around greenwashing. Green hushing is sort of a new concept really in the last few years, where companies started thinking, wait, if I'm going to get sued over this, well, maybe I should talk about sustainability or environment a little bit less. Well, in today's political landscape, we also know some of these words aren't the right ones to use, and so more and more corporations are being super conservative about how they talk about environment and sustainability. Personally, I think green hushing is a bigger risk than greenwashing, because greenwashing has been a concept out there for years and years with some boundaries around it, right? You're going to get sued if you say the wrong thing, if you put a falsehood out there, right? So I'm not going to do that as a corporation. Well, green hushing, not talking about all of the good stuff that's being done out there, losing the momentum in supply chains, in our companies, with consumers, about the good things that are happening. Again, I think that's much more risky, much more of a problem than greenwashing. Some of the other challenges, lack of standardization, limited scope, really trying to understand on a standard or certification, what is the full scope of coverage? Does it cover my whole supply chain? The cost piece, consumer confusion. I think one key piece around everything that Suzanne said, is how easy and straightforward can we make it for a consumer? Consumer wants to trust, but they need to know that when they see that label, when they see that logo, that truly means that this is a better product than the other one on the shelf. I mentioned the point about not just checking the box. Certification cannot be a check the box exercise. It has to involve and include all of the right practices all up and down the supply chain. It's not just a logo for logo's sake. I mean, really and truly, I think, the net of it is all across the supply chain, all of the players want the same things, right? Or at least it's the same topics, it's the same issues that we all struggle with. Now, we all struggle with them slightly differently. We have slightly different perspectives, okay? Upstream product designers and suppliers want to know if they go through a process of getting a standard or a certification that they can either charge more for it or sell more, right? The other end, the tension is brands and retailers, downstreamers, aren't necessarily going to want to pay that extra. You know, help them understand, what is that extra? Is it just a premium for the stamp? Or is it because it costs more to do all the things that make that a better product? And I think that's a real important piece of this. So conditions for success, I think, really are around, again, truth, believability, but also simplicity, right? Cost, if there's a premium, do I understand what that premium, what's a part of that? You know, is it manageable? Can it be passed down? You know, past me as the buyer from you all. Ease, you know, again, not to make it a check the box exercise, but if a brand or a retailer, downstream, you know, user, buyer, you know, they see the mark, okay, they want to know there's a lot there that I don't have to do. I don't have to worry about. Easy for me. You did all the work, but make it make sense to me. Make sure I know why it's better. And then to that point, is it really making a difference? Thank you.